All right. Good morning, everyone. Put my headphones on. Um, I figured we would go ahead and watch the rest of this Neanderthal documentary. We got to about, I think, uh, we got about 10 minutes left, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So if nobody has any initial um, questions or comments, how are y'all doing today on a Friday? Good?
Pretty good, yeah.
All right. Um,
Everything going well
well,
on your end?
yeah, it's the sun's out right now, kind of. So, and it's Friday. No problems here. We got a big push for 2 weeks ahead, and once we get through the next couple weeks, I think we're all going to be a little bit more settled. The school's doing a lot of work behind the scenes, getting ready for next fall, um, which many of you probably know that we're moving into, well, two different things. We're transitioning into to back to on ground, but also sort of that's going to be a little bit of a jolt for everybody. But also we're moving to 7 week semesters. So if you have not figured that out yet, it's something to definitely process and think about, because the majority of the classes will be held on that format, and you'll be taking, if you go 7 weeks, you'll be taking less classes um, as you go along. So if you take if you take 5 classes, let's say most students take 4 or 5, but let's say four classes in a semester, you would try to divide that up into 2 in the first session and 2 in the second session. Um, so yeah, and that makes us as professors teach differently. We're going to be having to reorganize and rethink our classes in many ways, and students too are going to have to adapt. So we're doing a bunch of training, and that's what next Friday, while I'm going to be absent Friday and Monday, I think. Um, I'll be giving you some assignments to do on your own. Um, that's what I'll be doing, is some training on that. So um, anyway, um, yeah, it's all good. I think the reason we're doing that is because success rates for students uh, goes up, and it's definitely a good um, it's a big jump for student success, and we'll see. We hope that plays out well. Any questions? All right, I'm gonna get this queued up to where we left off.
Oh, we can't hear that yet.
Okay, thanks. I think we left off around 30 minutes. Did we see about the music and the chimes in the cave yet? Anybody recall? I think they were climbing through the cave to get into this world inside the cave, if I'm not mistaken.
I think they were just getting started.
Say that again. Say that again.
And I was just saying, I think that's when they were getting started. They hadn't done the whole thing.
Okay, yeah, I think they were climbing into the cave when we stopped. Um, I'll try to.
Beyond simple tidiness, goes beyond stockpiling material. They're creating something. Even if it's just a kind of routine, habitual behavior, even if it has no symbolic meaning, it's still monumental what they leave behind. It would still, if you saw it today, look very, very striking.
Evidence that Neanderthals were capable of planning and building structures is rare. So the discovery of the Bruniquel cave in 1990 in France's Aveyron Valley caused a sensation. In a space located more than 300 meters from the entrance, archaeologists discovered several structures made of broken stalagmites. There are rings of this material, as well as random piles. The ring structures were later determined to be approximately 175,000 years old. Some scientists say that the Neanderthals who built these structures had developed a complex level of social organization.
There's a parallel between the bone heaps and the stalagmite circles at Bruniquel Cave. Both in a way are inexplicable in their order. Both are very, very structured. Of course, at Bruniquel, it's deep in the cave. They're not using food refuse, but it shows that they're capable of working together to create structure out of chaos without any obvious function. We've got lots of words for those sort of behaviors in our own language. We can call it symbolism, we can call it art, we can call it ritualistic behavior. I don't think those words are very helpful. I think it is just something very, very human to try and monumentalize landscape with our own traces and our own interventions on it.
A rare indication of Neanderthal abstract expression was discovered at Gorham's Cave on the Gibraltar Peninsula in 2014. A series of intersecting lines. The press dubbed it history's first hashtag. It's not clear what the symbols mean. Some experts, like Ludovic Slimak, caution against speculation.
There's evidence that early Homo sapiens made jewelry. They took the teeth of carnivores that they killed, drilled holes in them, and created necklaces. We found none of that among Neanderthals. No jewelry, necklaces, beads, or anything that might require drilling. And scientists have examined countless artifacts from that period. Humans wear jewelry and clothing to show off. These items shape our mental, cultural, and social universe, which we then present to others. Neanderthals simply didn't do that.
Future archaeological discoveries may prompt skeptics to change their minds. But this discussion also raises an important question. How closely did Neanderthals resemble modern people?
The science constantly changes how we envisage Neanderthals. And at the same time, we want to bring them close to us. We're seeing them as very modern in terms of their behavior. We should never forget the fact that if we were confronted by one, if we encountered one in the street or in the landscape, we'd instantly notice differences in their morphology, in their face, in their bearing, in their gait.
The first humans of the species Homo sapiens arrived in Western Europe about 50,000 years ago. This development appeared to seal the fate of the Neanderthals, who were far less sophisticated. Studies of the Mondrian cave, the reconstruction of settlements there, and the discovery of flint objects indicate that Homo sapiens came to Western Europe in two waves. The first consisted of scouting parties who used advanced flint tools. That group disappeared after about 10 years, and the Neanderthals gradually returned to the Mondrian site. Homo sapiens returned to the region a few thousand years later, around 42,000 years ago.
This cave was home to both the last Neanderthals and the first modern humans. They probably traveled north from the Mediterranean through the Rhone River Valley. They settled there, and it's likely that they came into contact with Neanderthals.
This was just about the time that the previous residents of this region, the Neanderthals, started to die out. There's been a lot of speculation about why and how this happened.
Les Néandertaliens étaient là depuis des générations.
The Neanderthals had been there for dozens, even hundreds of generations. But suddenly, with the arrival of Homo sapiens, they disappeared. They never returned to the caves where they had lived. Studies at sites in France, other parts of Europe, and Western Asia have concluded that the Neanderthal population became extinct about 42,000 years ago.
De l'extinction de la population.
Tom Hyam is an expert on carbon-14 dating. He's a professor of archaeological science at Oxford University and says that recent scientific studies have provided new information on why the Neanderthals died out.
And actually, this is different to what I originally thought when I first started working in this area. I thought that modern humans would kind of sweep in and Neanderthals would go extinct relatively soon after. But actually, it seems to be a lot more complicated than that. And there seems to be a mosaic of populations in different parts of Europe. We also know, of course, that the DNA is telling us that these two populations not only met, but they interbred with one another, which adds an increased layer of interest and complexity at the same time. I think over the 2,000 to 4,000 years in which we see modern humans and Neanderthals living or overlapping in Europe, that there was a slow and gradual disappearance of Neanderthal groups.
As Neanderthals started to interbreed with Homo sapiens, their numbers grew smaller and smaller until they eventually disappeared altogether.
I think the Neanderthals were to some extent trapped in their success. They survived for 200,000-300,000 years and through huge amounts of climate change in very challenging environments. But their culture remained pretty stable. For 200,000-300,000 years, they were making basically the same types of tools. They were exquisite tools, but the amount of innovation, the amount of creativity is minimal.
Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted across Eurasia for several thousand years. These ancient humans managed to survive major changes in climate, but they failed to adapt to the arrival of a superior species.
The thought that there was a point where there was a group of people, surviving in the same landscape who were superficially so similar to us, but maybe did things in a different way. It's almost like playing a hunter-gatherer thought experiment or something. I just think it's incredible that at one point we weren't the only human species that walked the earth as we are today.
I think that the way that we look at Neanderthals says a lot about how we deal with others. And this raises the question of how we treat other members of our species. Today, people are always talking about the cultural shock of migration. I think the situation is exaggerated, but it still reflects on how we deal with others.
From time to time, archaeologists find new evidence that helps us to better understand how Neanderthals lived. But these are just fragments from the long history of this species. Modern humans inherited part of their genetic code from Neanderthals. Perhaps that's why many of us are fascinated with the relics of these ancient people and the similarities that Neanderthals share with modern humans. If they had managed to survive, the world would likely be a very different place. Neanderthals developed a distinct social intelligence and were much more attuned to their environment than was the species that replaced them. We can only speculate on what influence the Neanderthals might have had on the course of human history, for better or for worse.
So, any Any thoughts about this? What you just watched in this documentary? That any questions or what we've read and what we just watched? Are there any discrepancies? Anybody picked up on?
I am a little bit interested in how far separated we are, like via the genome, from Neanderthals, because I really don't know.
Yeah.
Just thought.
Yeah. Well, we share 1 to 4%, depending upon which region of the world your roots are. But if you have any European or Asian genetic background, then you're going to have 1 to 4%. Said we have about 99% of the same genome, basically, with Neanderthals, or a similar genotype, similarity. Very much well like if you look at us in relationship to chimps, it's about 98%. So yeah, it's very similar. We're genetically, now what the genes say and what the morphology says are, you don't really know where, because that's matching those two up is often, that's kind of, there's a correlation, but there definitely is speculation in that realm, of knowing, physically and also behaviorally, um, how to sync up the genes and the changes in the genetic code, with what's happening physically, morphologically. We just don't have a window into that world. We have two different lines of evidence: genetics and the physical archaeological record and the fossils. But they're parallel in each other. But it's kind of how to sync them up and how to know exactly, with precision. That's speculation. That's what the scientists are constantly trying to fill that out with, more information through the archaeological record and the fossil record. But yeah, any other thoughts about this?
I've always wanted to know what happened to them. It just seemed like they just vanished. That's always fascinated me more, because they were so remarkable.
Yeah, they were more spread out. They didn't have denser populations. They did not populate densely, so they did not have cities, to say the least. They lived more sparsely, and therefore that minimized their evolutionary capacity, and their inability to communicate to that what the scientists said there at the end, about the technology, I think says a lot, because they stayed with the same grade of technology and tools throughout. And there is some small evidence that we looked at from Central Asia that seems to indicate that they messed around with some bones, but there's no pattern throughout. Where you find fossils, you don't find bone tools, or jewelry, or the artwork that you find in modern sapiens. They just sort of stay in a certain grade of technology that indicates, and why I bring that up at the same time we talk about why they died out. They did very well in some very difficult environmental conditions, to respond to it, but at the same time, they did not change and they did not evolve, and that sometimes has to do with population density and the social relations, because the more social we became, which is indicative of the number of people, our brains were evolving. Now that has something to do with our food supply as well. So there's a lot of factors to play in, but yeah, I mean, their food supply was somewhat limited by their technology and their tools. But very, very, very strong thought of what I've read. The thread that I continue to see is that they remain sort of disconnected from each other in pockets. Their movement, their range of movement was always minimal, although they did move out to Central Asia, but they're sparsely populated out there. So yeah, we're going to talk about this, as you'll see. We're going to talk about this at the very start of the next chapter. So we'll definitely be visiting the question of what was the relationship between modern sapiens and Neanderthals, because that's still something that is greatly debated and very, very much indicative of the different threads, of the different avenues that we could go down with trying to decide why did Neanderthals disappear, and why did sapiens become so successful. So Neanderthals, like this documentary says, it's really knowing about Neanderthals and our approach to our Neanderthals is indicative of how we approach people who are different from us today. And I think that definitely is something that is striking to me, because we don't do well with people of difference. We don't do well when we see people migrating into our homeland, and we react to them as being a threat to our way of life. And you wonder, when we look at Neanderthals being thought that they are a continuance of us, you wonder, I mean, what was going on back then when they ran into each other? And not only that, but our response to them now, today, looking back at them and who they were, and the idea of them being part of us and who we are, people are somewhat resistant to that idea. And so, yeah, this is obviously built into the mythology of Neanderthal. Yeah, let's jump over to the next chapter and get that ball rolling before we run out of time this week. Okay, let's see. So we have the schedule again. Y'all need to turn in your final paper at the end of tomorrow. So just FYI, the 17th, I'll be looking for your article reports. Are there any questions about those article reports while we're on this moment? I'm looking forward to reading them, because I always learn something, because students read those and have different takes on them, and hopefully they'll be worth your while and something that enhances your understanding. That's what I'll be looking for in your report. But the Dropbox will be open until 10 o'clock tomorrow on Saturday. We have definitely like I said, we have some dates coming up next week. Next Friday, which will be, I think, the 23rd. The 23rd. And then Monday, the 26th, where I most likely will not be here. And so I'll be giving some assignments with some videos that I usually show for both these chapters. And one that I'll probably show as we cover the next chapter, chapter 11. But there's one or two that I'd like to probably show for chapter 12 that I'll have you watch. And unfortunately, one of them is only now living on Amazon Prime. So I don't know how many people have Amazon Prime, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. There's plenty of videos out there that we don't require a subscription. So with chapter 11, we are obviously entering into the world of modern sapiens, and we're going to ask these questions and answer them, try to answer them as best we can as we go along here. When did we first appear? That's kind of the $1 million question. And not only that, when we appeared, but the transition into taking over the world, so to speak, with our the fossil record. Where did that take place, and how did that take place? So this sort of change over of the guard from sapiens from Neanderthals to sapiens. How did this dispersal take place of modern sapiens? And there's a couple different theories we're going to look at. And again, this is something that we have a great documentary. This is one documentary that I love to show. It's 2012, but it's one that I've been showing since I've taught this class back in the back when this was a new video actually. And it's called Mind the Big Bang, and it talks about the evolutionary sort of change of the culture of modern sapiens, and the artifacts that we have, and the art, literally the art world, and just some of the stuff that was taking place technology-wise, that's very significant to what made modern sapiens. So that's something that we're going to be visiting as we go along here. So, like I said, there's a couple theories that you need to be familiar with as we look at this question of how sapiens took over and replaced Neanderthals. There's two different theories, and then there's a third. And anytime you set up this polarity of one theory versus another, it tends to be, and you have this sort of like, it's either this or that. There's always something in between that tends to make more sense. But the two extremities, and there's two sides of the coin that are debated, is the regional continuity model, RCM, and then there is the complete replacement model, CRM. So regional continuity model is also referred to as multi-regional evolution. And that, they kind of say what they are in the title, and that there was, in this regional continuity model, the belief is that as Erectus left, Habilis and Erectus left Africa and migrated into Eurasia, the evolution track of Erectus habilis to Erectus to Heidelbergensis to Neanderthal happened regionally throughout the world, and then Neanderthal evolved into modern sapiens. That is the regional continuity model, and it says that basically each region where pre-modern sapiens lived, they locally evolved into modern sapiens, and they all evolved into the same modern sapien form. And so that is something that it's simpler to understand. It's kind of cleanly cut. It's nicely packaged, it also supports some unfortunate tone of the racial model. So why is it that we have different quote unquote races? And we know that genetically races don't exist, as we'll see in chapter 12. But the idea of the different variation of humans, from our physical feature, which there is differences, as we're going to look at in chapter 12. There are differences in the modern populations, physically speaking, around the world. But it really, it's those differences are really pretty minute, relatively speaking. So again, this is a simpler model, and it's one in which doesn't get as much traction, to say the least, in the scientific community as the other model, which we're going to look at. Why is that? Why do you think it might not get as much traction? What's potentially problematic about that? What's the major question that this might evoke? What's the main, what could be the main sort of like, how could that actually be? Main thing is, how can individuals in completely different environments evolve anatomically into the same modern sapien? So that, the fact that those groups, Erectus, Neanderthals, they did not interbreed. They were very separated. They didn't have cars, obviously. They didn't ride. They probably didn't ride. There's some speculation, but they probably didn't ride horses. They weren't able to move and interweave with each other. And so, but therefore, if they stayed in their local regions, how is it that they could actually evolve into the same species for in some hundreds and thousands of years? We're talking, if you look at Erectus, 2-point-something million years ago, to Neanderthal, up to 30,000-40,000 years ago, you're talking about millions of years. How is it that these groups that weren't interbreeding with each other, how is it that they just happened to end up in the same morphological genetic form of modern sapiens? That's the main ringer to this theory. The response from those who do defend this theory say, well, gene flow and interbreeding, of course, that's how species stay the same, and speciation, creating new species, is from the separation of the gene pool. Right? We've talked about this. So you'll see this brings us back around to the beginning of the semester. This is what I love about this semester. It loops back around to our discussion about genes at the start, and it all kind of connects here.
Well, you said that. I mean, according to what we've learned so far, like it says that if we're all in some form connected genetically, and you were talking about, pressures in environmental factors, I guess it would just mean that despite the regions they're in, right, they would still kind of have the same pressures to progress, right, for survival. Is that what it would be? Or
well, be wrong. So no, the environmental pressures, if we're talking about, so you don't have any genetic flow, right? So good, that's a good memory, because we actually talked about speciation, environmental speciation theory, where the environment plays the biggest factor in creating a new species. So if the environmental pressures are different in one context on one island, like we talked about with the finches, you're going to evolve morphological changes and genetic changes from the response to the environment than you would on another island that has a different ecological environmental pattern. So yes, these different regions of the world would all have to have, they do all have different environmental pressures. And so they could press those pre-modern humans into different, they would press those different groups into different species eventually. Because we're talking about a wide range from Southern Europe, Western Southern Europe, to Central Asia, and then into China, with Erectus. This is definitely, and then down to Java. Those are areas that have completely different weather patterns, and so it would create different species, for sure. But that didn't happen. That did not happen. There was no, gene flow between these groups. So that would definitely lead to different species. So the response to the response, no gene flow. The reaction. You got to have gene flow to maintain the continuity of a species. And yeah. Again, regional continuity model is an extreme model. And it doesn't get as much traction because of some of the holes in this theory, but it is noteworthy, but it's very doubtful. But it's good to have these models to be able to understand exactly probably what did take place. So the other model is the complete replacement model. It's another extreme model. And basically it says that there was no transition in these regions. In fact, what happened was, like we talked about Erectus and potentially Habilis, but most definitely Erectus left Africa, populated the parts of the world that we looked at, possibly evolved into Heidelbergensis and Neanderthals. But then there was a couple different waves of modern sapiens that moved out of Africa around 100,000 years ago and completely replaced the Neanderthals without interbreeding. And this replacement model actually says no interbreeding. We know that's not true. We know that there is overlap in genetic code today. But when this model came out, they didn't have the genome for the Neanderthal. We do now, but at the time they did not. The fossil record, which we have had, the fossil record gives support to this theory more so than the genetic story. So that is something that is there's some contradiction, of course. So if you have the fossils, again, just because you have fossils doesn't mean you know the behavior and you don't know the genes of those fossils at the time. But there is speculation. There's strong speculation because now we can track genetic changes, and we can calculate the changes of our genes by time period. So there is some correlation, like I mentioned earlier. There is some correlation that can be found based upon the genetic markers. As we're going to look at that in a minute. So another important feature that we need to point out about African genetic history is the diversity of the genes in Africa. There is more genetic diversity in Africa than anywhere else in the world, which means that there is longer roots of human history in Africa, because the longer a species lives in a region, the more mutations that take place in that region, and that gives more genetic diversity. We'll come back to that in a minute. Any questions about this? The big question here is, how is it that modern sapiens replaced all those groups in Neanderthals, and why didn't they interbreed? So, we're talking about Euro Neanderthal, Asia Heidelbergensis and Erectus. How was it that we were so more evolved that we took over and wiped them out? That's the million-dollar question. So, like I said, you have two polarities. You have one extreme example of complete replacement, and you have the other example of regional continuity. And there's always somewhere in between, kind of like the difference between the lumpers and the splitters. You always have somewhere in the middle that is probably is where the truth falls. So you have a couple things to look at here. Anatomically, modern sapiens definitely evolved in Africa around 195,000 years ago. We're going to look at the fossil and the genetic evidence of that. It dispersed out of Africa and interbred with sapiens that were already existing elsewhere, pre-modern sapiens primarily, Heidelbergensis, Erectus, and even Neanderthals. So there is probably, this combination model believes that there was some interbreeding happen. There had to be, because we know that we share genetics with Neanderthals. Europe, where we have the most evidence, in particular Western Europe, you have the most evidence of the classic Neanderthal. Probably you might have had more replacement there than you did in other regions, because of the fossil evidence that exists so densely in that region. But again, if you're European descent, you have some ancestry to Neanderthals. So you got Neanderthal in you. So they were dating for sure. So looking at the genetic evidence, one thing that you're going to hear about and you're going to read about in this chapter is the most recent common ancestor. When we do our family tree, we are rooting back to, we're trying to diagnose our oldest ancestor that we know of, right? So our genetics can tell us even a deeper story than we can tell with the artifacts that we have in the libraries, and so our genes are like a window into our family tree. And when you hear the most recent common ancestor, MRCA, it sounds like a cola, we are looking for that deepest, what we call the node, the deepest node of our tree. And where does the branch begin? And we're looking at comparing genes, and when we talk about genes produce proteins, right? And genes produce the phenotypes. They're the code of our proteins, which produce our phenotype. So mitochondria E and Y chromosome A, these are symbolic genetic points in time, and we use the all the database that's being created around the world of the genetic representation. This is what's happening. We're going around the world collecting gene samples, genetic samples, and trying to fill out the story of our genetic legacy. And what they're trying to do is establish the mutation, where mutations took place in the world and when they took place. So the more genetic information we have, the more we can be accurate with this story. So for every mutation that takes place, there's a new, what we call a haplogroup. And so with that haplogroup, there is thought to be a genetic change, right? So this is something that prehistorically because we now know kind of the rate of mutations and how often they happen, we can line that up with the fossil record, because remember, we can date fossils based upon various methods we've looked at. So we can line up the fossil record with the mutation rates of our genetic code. And we now know that there's about 18 major haplogroups, haplotypes. And that's when you do your DNA sample, when you send that in to wherever you send it to. I recommend National Geographic, the Genome project they have there. That's what you're doing. That's exactly what you're doing. And they will find more mutations as they develop larger database of DNA samples. Any questions about this? So there's two different forms of DNA that are being collected: the mtDNA and the Y chromosome. The mtDNA, actually, I think this would be a good place for us to pick up on Monday. So yeah, we'll talk about more about this genetic evidence on Monday, and yeah, if you want to hang out, if you got any questions, you're welcome to hang out in a minute or two. I'll stay on. If not, I'll see you on Monday. Y'all have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.